Okay, so let's just get into it. All right, thanks all for coming. So just to introduce myself, for those who don't know me, I'm Adi. So tonight my sharing is titled When We Fight. And what I mean by this title, When We Fight, is two things. Number one, it's when we fight for God. And second is when we fight with, as in against God and against others. It's unfortunate, but because of our human nature, which is to sin, these two things are inextricably linked together. When we fight for God, there will always come a time when we will fight against Him and against others. It is inevitable that as we walk the path of God, when we follow our faith, there will come a time in our lives when we will be in conflict with others, our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, and also when we are in conflict with God. This is what this Sunday's Mass readings deal with. The question, what should we do when we are in conflict with our brothers and sisters in faith? And what is it that we should do when we are in conflict with God? The Mass readings today comes from the prophet Jeremiah, from Paul in the letter to the Romans, and from the Gospel of Matthew. Each touch a different facet of conflict in our lives of faith. Now I know that conflict arises in all parts of our lives, in our family life, in our work life, and also in our social life. Tonight, however, I will focus on conflict in our faith life, because these conflicts will define us as Catholics, and that our learnings from this Sunday's readings should be transferable to our conflicts outside of our faith life. So firstly, I won't go through the readings in order. First, I'll go through Jeremiah and then to Matthew before finishing up with Romans. Jeremiah deals with the conflict between us and God. Matthew deals with the conflict between us and our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. While finally, Romans tells us what we can do about these conflicts. So, on to Jeremiah. Just a basic background, Jeremiah is a book of the Old Testament, and it is the tale of the prophet Jeremiah, who was called to a prophetic life by God to preach his word, to share his truth. So in Jeremiah 20:7-9, the prophet opens quite dramatically by saying, "You seduced me, Lord, and I let myself be seduced." In other translations, the stronger and more negative word deceived is used instead of seduced. His accusatory tone is clear and sets out that he is in a state of conflict with God. He directly complains about God, just as if someone tricked him to buy a defective car. The reason for his complaint becomes evident as he continues. "All day long I am an object of laughter. Everyone mocks me. The word of the Lord has brought me reproach and derision all day long." So his life as a prophet, following God's calling, has only brought him suffering and ridicule. It is to be noted that scholars believe that when he wrote this, Jeremiah was in prison. So what we have here is a man who has been worn out by a life following God's calling. That because of his preaching and because of his responsibility to spread God's message, he has been brought to a desperate and miserable place. What we see in this Sunday's reading, however, is only 2 verses of Jeremiah's rant against God. He continues on until verse 18, where he lays out all of his complaints, how people plotted against him, how his friends turned against him, became suspicious of him, and wished him to fail, before finally shouting out how he would rather not be born, which frankly can be seen as a rejection of God's love. If we assume, as the people did back then, that creation is one of the greatest acts of love by God, he's rejecting that very love. What Jeremiah shows is that everyone will be in conflict with God as we walk in our faith. Jeremiah is a prophet chosen by God. Perhaps during his time, he had the closest connection to God compared to his peers, and yet he could still be in conflict with God. So, what is the source of this conflict? It can be persecution that comes from following God's calling. It can be ridicule and the loss of friends. But I think it boils down to the feeling of being betrayed. Coming back to the first thing that Jeremiah said, that he is deceived, he is seduced. He expected something, but in the end received something that is completely different from what he envisioned. He was called to a life of a prophet, but in the end, he is treated with ridicule. He is treated not as a prophet, but as a criminal, as an outcast. I also believe that a part of this conflict is also due to the humanity of Jeremiah. There is a need in all of us humans, a desire to be loved, a desire to be safe and protected. In his calling, could be said, or arguably, he did not receive this. We can only imagine him being one man versus the world, the degree of stress and fear that comes with his calling. No one has the perfect faith of Jesus, Jeremiah included. So it is his humanity that causes him to be in conflict with God, that causes him and us to cry out and berate God. We see this in his tone within this passage, that he is beyond exhausted, that he is at the end of his rope. Likewise, I think in our faith lives, we see this also. We are called to be followers of God. We are called to deny ourselves and deny the worldly ways. But in doing so, we place ourselves at different ends with the world around us. We may be called irrational, blinded by faith. We may go against family and friends. And when this happened, we don't necessarily blame God for our affliction. Jeremiah himself didn't blame God, but we may grow frustrated, disheartened, and unconfident in our faith, resulting in us crying out or complaining or lashing out to God. In fact, such conflict might not necessitate us to be even suffering. We could be looking at all the suffering in the world. Today, there's plenty of it. There's coronavirus, there's dictators in Belarus, there's explosion in Beirut, there's people, African Americans, being gunned down in the US. And we can see all this suffering and we can be frustrated by God's seeming inactivity in all of this. This could very well lead us to conflict with God. We question our faith. We complain about his letting such injustices go unpunished. The catastrophic impact that can arise from these conflicts with God, whether born from our own suffering or not, is that it can lead us to give up, to not care, to leave his path. I'm pretty sure we've all experienced this before. When you constantly fight or argue with someone, and then at the end you just say, I don't want to deal with it anymore, and you fall out of a relationship. This is perhaps the worst possible outcome when we are in conflict with God, that in the end we leave him and his path. So then the question is, what should we do when we are in conflict with God? So we'll answer that in Romans, but first I want to turn to the gospel. The whole of the gospel for this Sunday's mass reading is Matthew 16, 21 to 27. But for tonight, I just want to focus on verses 21 to 23, which reads, From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly from the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. God forbid, Lord, no such thing shall ever happen to you. He turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. So in this passage, Jesus starts by telling his disciples that he has to go to Jerusalem and be sacrificed and die and for being raised up again. In response to this, Peter told Jesus that it's not going to happen. Jesus' response to Peter is what I find to be the most interesting here and one of the most memorable verses in the Bible for me. Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." He called Peter Satan. He didn't call him a fool or an idiot or any of those other words, but he called Peter the rock on which the church is built, Satan. And I don't think there is any other occasion in which Jesus called someone, even the Pharisees, as Satan. This passage highlights the conflicts that Peter and Jesus faced as, we can say, brothers in faith. Let's examine the interaction from Peter's point of view when he says, "No such thing shall ever happen to you. You won't be persecuted, you won't be killed." Arguably, this isn't coming from a place of malice or ill intent. In fact, it could be coming from a place of good, just like how we try to console someone that's down or someone that's pessimistic. But why would it evoke such a strong response from Jesus? Why was Jesus being so harsh here? And I think it's because Jesus realizes that Peter has taken his eyes off the ball. Peter may be innocently trying to defend his teacher, but in doing so, he has forgotten that Jesus is the Son of God. That the Father himself, in the mountain where Jesus was transfigured, has revealed to Peter the truth of Christ and has commanded Peter to listen and hear him. Here, Peter has lost his way. He has been taken in by human desires and thus intervenes against God's plan. That's why Jesus rebukes him harshly. This is why Jesus said, "You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." The cause of this conflict between Jesus and Peter is a disagreement as to what God's plans are. Jesus understood that he has to die as part of God's saving will. But Peter doesn't understand this and has forgotten his role as Jesus' disciple. Similarly, we as followers of Christ often have disagreements that may arise to fights and to conflicts because we believe our own version of God's plans. You see this in the history of the Catholic Church. The Reformation and the breakage of Martin Luther is a conflict because of two different viewpoints, though you see this every day in different churches. Outside of the Catholic Church or even within the Catholic Church, different denominations fighting each other on ideas of theology, which to some extent is healthy, but often we see it escalating in such a disastrous and catastrophic way, leading to rifts within churches and torn relationships. In fact, we even see this within people serving together in the same church. You can have Mary and Martha arguments, one claiming that what they're doing is the right and only way. Before I continue, there's a side note that I want to just say as a disclaimer. So I just want to make it clear that I think debate in theology is a good thing, that the sharing and passing of ideas or the discussion of ideas as how to serve God and what is the best way to serve our neighbor, these are good questions and discussions and debates to have. But to debate doesn't necessarily mean to fight. To fight and to be in conflict is when relationships becomes threatened to be torn, when abandonment becomes a clearer and clearer possibility. Okay. So what do we do when we're in conflict with our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ? Should we just say, "Get thee behind me, Satan"? Well, the thing is, we ain't Jesus. We don't have 20/20 visions on God's plan. We don't know God's heart and God's will as clearly as Jesus knew. So we can't call someone Satan. So back to the questions then from the start. What should we do when we are in conflict with God? And what should we do when we're in conflict with our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ? Let's finally turn to our reading in Romans 12, 1 to 2. But let's specifically look at verse 2, which reads, "Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect." Firstly, we have to understand that debates, differences, and fights is part of the transformative work of God. When we wrestle with God and when we debate with our fellows, it is part of our faith journey. Specifically, what Paul mentions here as the renewal of the mind. We have to be aware, what we have to be aware of is that within our human nature, and because of the temptations of, well, the devil or the body or the ego, it can lead us to transform what could be a transformative exercise or experience to a destructive one, destroying our relationship and our love to God and to others. And secondly, it's about discernment. In one aspect, it's about discerning the will of God, and in the other, it's about discerning what Paul describes as good, pleasing, and perfect. So let's look at what he means by good, pleasing, and perfect. So in the Greek, good is agathos. It means something more than good. It means something that originates from God or is empowered by God. Pleasing is eurestos, which means by one's judgment is fully acceptable. And perfect is, in Greek, is teleion, which means through development, something is made mature, something is made perfect. So what are we to discern? Well, number one, of course, is God's will. What does he want us to do? Is there a reason for us to be in conflict? Is there a reason for us to suffer in Christ? But number two, I think what we have to discern also is what is good, what is agathos. What or who originates from God or is empowered by God? Often when we fight with each other, we fail to see that the other person as being originated from God. We identify them as enemy, as opponent, and we fail to see that they are also God's creation. And that if they are also our brothers and sisters in Christ, that they're also empowered by God, just as we are empowered by God to serve him. This is perhaps one of the most important things for us to discern and to understand. Remember that although Peter is the only person that Jesus has called Satan, he is also the person tasked by Jesus to be the rock, the foundation of the church, the first pope. Although at that point Jesus was in conflict with Peter, he knew, understood, and believed in the godly origin of Peter, and that Peter was anointed, empowered, and shall be appointed by God to be the leader of his church. Likewise, we must resist our temptation to vilify God and others and understand their origin from God. And the last two, which is eurestos, we have to ask ourselves, what is pleasing to my judgment, what is pleasing to their judgment, and what is pleasing to God's judgment. For finally looking at what is perfect, teleion, which is from our current state of tension and conflict and differences, where can it go to reach perfection? What is the end goal and how do we reach it? Discernment, in the end, is an act of reflection and prayer. It is an act that pulls us out of the fight. It is through discernment that we overcome the destructive possibility of broken relationships and lost loves, whether with God or with others, and leads us to growth, leads us to what is good, pleasing, and perfect. So that's my sharing for tonight. These are some of the discussion questions which would help us kind of explore further our experiences of conflict with God and with others, and how we've learned to deal with them. So with that in mind, I pass it on to Kelvin to organize the small group. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, let me. I would ask. I would like to ask for permission. I would like to share. Well, first of all, thank you, Adi, for the sharing. But before we get into the small groups, I just want to invite you guys. For those of you, especially those of you who has been attending WIFEL diligently, I shared a link into the chat group. So we CFJ, we're going to have a virtual prayer event, a 24 hours virtual prayer event this weekend to pray, mainly to pray for humanity and our distress against COVID, and also we will also pray for other personal intentions as well. If you would like to join us, just fill in the form that's in that link, and then we will send you the link where you can join us this weekend. That's it for me. Thank you.